Thank you very much, Adam, for all your work. Come on down. Yes, Adam Apollo. Thank you. Thank you for your work, my friend.
My pleasure, brother. My pleasure.
Good afternoon. How are you all? How's this sound for you? Can you hear my voice well? Okay, good. Well, here we are, portal to ascension, figuring out how to vibrate into higher dimensions. And as I like to say, frequency is something that's not just about going higher or going lower. Understanding frequency is like understanding music. If you just have high notes, you don't get the whole song, do you? As we're looking at this process of ascending, as I talked about on the panel the first night, we have to really consider, what does it mean to be a whole and integrated being? To get above our troubles and our shadows and our issues, we have to not only understand them, but we have to embrace them. We have to learn how to integrate the most challenging parts of what it means to be a human race. Otherwise, we think we're just gonna, move on and vibrate right out of this dimension and just leave the earth trashed and destroyed. That's not the revelation that I want to live in. That's not what I want for my children. And while I know and I believe that we are spiritual beings, fundamentally and first, I also look at the exquisite beauty of the choice of being a divine being, choosing to come into matter. Is such a choice of a divine being something that could be considered a fall or bad, to become part of an experience where we're not just one with everything, but that we are together in relationship? I think not. For I have experienced great love. Have you experienced great love? Is that great love not a gift that has come from being different from others? From being separate from other people? By acknowledging our differences, do we not find the greater capacity for love? Yes? So, my talk today is not about love. Although, at its deeper level, it really is. Because where we're going together today is into how ascension can happen literally. How we can literally ascend from this planet. Now, why would we want to do that? Because we're not going to just leave this place a trash heap, are we? But we are going to gain the insights that people like Edgar Mitchell did. People who could see the earth and understand that we are stewards of a living, breathing body, of a precious gem that is a gift to all of us, for all of our lives, for all life. And so, why do we build starships? Well, I think it's a much better mechanism of getting a few billion people off of this planet than mass death, don't you? Let's not kill them all off. Let's actually expand. Let's support Gaia in her orgasmic process of releasing her seed into the galaxy. Does that sound like fun? Okay, great. Enough sexual metaphors. Moving on. To start with, in really looking at this picture that we're going to dive in today, we need to get caught up on physics for a moment. Okay, so I'm going to drop some concepts. Some of these might be a little technical. Some of it might be a little difficult. But I promise you, I'm going to bring you home. Okay, I'm not going to just leave you out in the expanses of quantum mechanics. So the question we start with is, what is space-time made of? In other words, what the heck is this matrix that we're all a part of? How am I? What is this? This question has plagued philosophers and thinkers and visionaries since the beginning of time. If we look back in ancient history, physicists used to be philosophers. And at the heart of all kinds of philosophy was this idea of this thing that was called the ether, this fundamental field. And this fundamental field was said to give rise to the elements, the fire, air, earth, water, spirit, to give rise to emotions, to give rise, even in Descartes' work, to gravity. In fact, if we look around the world, we can see the same description of this fundamental field that we're all a part of. In Egypt, as the Kaaba and Ak. In Hinduism, as the Mahabhuta. The Wu Jing in China. And the ether is a Greek term. We also know it as the quintessence in medieval days. And eventually, through essentially the pressures of different groups, we lost this somehow. But all the way back in history, space itself was seen as energy, was seen as ether, was seen as the vital force, the essence, the chi, the ki, the prana, the odic force, the biofield, the human energy field. And we have to ask ourselves, wait a second, so you mean philosophy and physics already had consciousness integrated into it thousands of years ago? Like over the last millennia? And the answer is yes. It was already there. Of course it was there. That's where we had to start. But what happened? Well, the Roman Catholic Church has this very strong idea that says if you talk about this fully underlying field that is in everything, that sounds like God. That is our domain. You have to come to our buildings and you got to pay us money if you want access to the divinity. Okay? You come here or you know. Sorry, that was like 5 different accents I slipped into. I was trying to keep it Russian there for a moment, but yes, sometimes I slip from the Russian. So basically the church was like really giving everybody heck. And if you know anything about Newton's life, you know he was actually an alchemist. He was not just a physicist, he was an alchemist, but he was an alchemist in secret. Because if the church had known about it, they'd have come after him. Well, then that led to a lot of scientists trying to kind of pull the ether out. How do we extract it from our conversation and get it out of the way? So let's figure out, instead of fire, what's thermodynamics? Instead of air forces, it's aerodynamics. Instead of water, it's hydrodynamics. Let's get out of talking about things in a spiritual way, right? And start looking at things in a physics way. And the last vestige of the ether was known as the luminiferous ether. In other words, it was the study of how light travels through space. And there must be some function for how light travels through space. Well, you know, if there was an ether, Michelson and Morley said, well, let's put our tabletop down and let's see if we can detect, using lasers, basically, if we can detect how Earth is flying through space. And if it is, and there's an ether, it should pass through this table and it should cause a distortion here, right? Not a bad idea. Of course, they never considered the idea that the table and the space and the air and everything around the planet is moving with the planet. We're in a big vortex. It's not like we're traveling 1,000 miles an hour towards the east and you're getting hit by 1,000 mile an hour wind, right? That would be pretty intense. We'd be like, all right, good morning, guys. Like, we're cruising on the earth. So Einstein's general relativity, special relativity came out, and he's like, we can understand light without an ether. The scientists were like, yes. And it was dead. But it wouldn't be dead for long, because it wasn't much further in time that Einstein came back around and he produced general relativity, and he goes, oh, actually, you can't really have the mechanics of light bending around a star or anything having to do with light and gravity unless there's an ether. And he wrote a paper called The Ether and Relativity.
Einstein, who in 1920 said,
there are weighty arguments to be adduced in favor of the ether hypothesis. To deny the ether is ultimately to assume that empty space has no physical qualities whatsoever. The fundamental facts of mechanics do not harmonize with this view. According to the general theory of relativity, space is endowed with physical qualities. In this sense, therefore, there exists an ether. According to the general theory of relativity, space without ether is unthinkable.
According to general relativity, space without ether is unthinkable. And you know what happened to that paper? That's a quote directly from this paper. Nobody picked it up. Everybody ignored it. Einstein, literally the most famous scientist in the entire planet, publishes this paper, and what do? The entire scientific community ignores it and says, Einstein, he's getting old. He thinks there's still ether. We don't need it no more. Now we have quantum mechanics, right? We've got Bohr, we've got Heisenberg. Okay, we are on the right track. But that track led to this massive break in physics, a great divide. And that great divide left us with no connection between the physics of the big and the physics of the small. The physics of the big was all about gravity, right? And stars and planets and galaxies. The physics of the small was all about the mechanics of particles and waves, protons and neutrons and electrons. And then eventually, quarks and leptons and all the things that happen when we smash together particles at near the speed of light. And so we had this massive issue in physics. And for the last century, for a lot of, essentially the 1900s, we had people trying to solve this gap. And the two biggest theories that came out to fix this problem were string theory, which the musicians love because everything is music. Everything's vibrating. Of course it is, right? We know that's true, but string theory is pretty abstract and the mathematics don't really land very well. On the other side, we have loop quantum gravity, which says that everything in space-time is a structural network of energy. Now, I really like that one. I read Lee Smolin's book, 3 Roads to Quantum Gravity, back when I was 16, and I was like, this is the key, because I can tell that things are both vibrating, like strings, and have a fundamental geometric structure. Now, why would I think that? Well, look at nature. Everything is geometric. Everything is interconnected. From small scales to big scales, we find geometry is the key. And I, in my own revelations of different things happening, had come across Buckminster Fuller as well, who literally is describing how geometric mechanics of triangulated systems can create literally everything, can create the structure of everything. And I didn't find this for, probably 10 to 15 years after a lot of the work that I'm going to show you on quantum gravity that I've done. But Buckminster Fuller actually said specifically that the gravitational field is created by omnitriangulated geodesic spheres. Nobody caught this, by the way. But what I'm going to show you is just how profound that insight actually is. So this is me in high school, normal kid, depressed for a long time, then realized I had an energy body, started doing blindfolded martial arts and Jedi training and downloading, essentially my senior project in high school was the fusion of science and spirituality through unified field theoretics. And I think I put as much drop shadow and bevel on that crazy-looking text as I possibly could manage. And I was diagramming the geometric progressions of the energy body itself and the relationships between the layers of the energy body and micro and macrocosmic structures. How do the things that are small and the things that are big get connected by consciousness? And I became a student of Bohr and Einstein and Gordon Kane and Lee Smolin and Barbara Ann Brennan. You guys know that name? Thank goodness for Barbara Ann Brennan. What an amazing woman. Dan Winter as well and his amazing work, Brian Greene. And so essentially, this is my output of my work in high school, which was the unified harmonic matrix. And essentially, I figured out how all the levels of the universe have self-similarity in their processes and actions across scale. That's not this presentation, but you can go on YouTube and you can search for a unified harmonic matrix. There's a really old version that I wasn't dressed very well for, and the screens are really bad. There's also a new version-ish from 2019 at Contact in the Desert. I hope you enjoy it. Essentially, the essence of what you get out of that connects to where we're going in this presentation is that consciousness is an evolution of self-awareness. That there's a process that consciousness goes through in the emanation from being one to being differentiated, to being in relationship, to knowing itself, to becoming self-aware of its own choice for differentiation, and so on and so forth. And tomorrow, Monday, I'm going to do a workshop that shows how each one of these geometric progressions, each one of these steps, is actually connected to magic across cultures and time. It connects to our literal ability to create exactly what we want to create in this world. In a physics sense, it also shows us that very simple patterns can unify physics. And then if you just look at the basic geometric progression from the 1 to the 7, you realize inherent in that is literally every other number, every other pattern, every other system, except for primes. But we're not going to talk about primes today because that's Robert Grant's job. I don't know if he's in this room, but he could get into some primes for you, but we're not going to do that. So simple patterns unify physics. And what I came down to is the reality that the biggest deal about all of this really is the mechanics of the pentagram, the hexagram, and the heptagram. That's 5, 6, and 7. And these three geometries, I mean, I was literally obsessed with them when I was young. And I used to draw 5-pointed stars going into 6-pointed stars, making a 7-pointed star. And I would just do that all the time. And it was like, this is it. This is just like the imprint of consciousness. But I didn't realize how big of a deal they are and how absolutely critical they are to my entire galactic mission of being on the Earth and what I'm here to do in this time, which we're going to talk about later. So quantum gravity says everything's this discrete structural network of energy. Everything's a network of energy, right? But they didn't know what the geometry was of that network. They had no way to figure that out. You've also got this issue called the vacuum catastrophe, where quantum mechanics essentially says, oh, well, if we look at how much energy should be in this empty space, the result is that the entire energy of the entire universe all put together should fit in every cubic centimeter of space. That's how much energy should be there. And they were like, oh no, this is terrible. This is horrible. That's obvious. That can't be true, can it? It can't be true that there's that much energy in this little spot, can it? Well, I don't know what to do with that. It just makes all the equations go basically to infinity almost. I think what we should do is just zero it out. Let's just remove the biggest factor from all our equations. And we're talking about a 10 with 120 zeros difference, by the way. That's a big, big, big amount of energy. But it turns out there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for how there's that much energy in space-time. And that explanation is that space-time itself is made of these little bundles of light, what we call the Schwarzschild condition of a quanta of light, also known as a Planck spherical unit, if you follow Nissim Harriman's work. These little bundles of light collapsed in on themselves, they are actually the real, more like atoms. They're like the fundamental structure of light itself. And that light is now interconnected in this geometric field, but how can it be if it's that energetic? How can this all seem empty? Well, it's in equilibrium. It's all in balance. In fact, it's so perfectly balanced that you can't even tell all that energy is there. And how is it perfectly balanced? Well, Buckminster Fuller, once again, brings us the idea of tetrahedral triangulation. That's how you balance extreme forces and make it seem like nothing's going on at all, right? So we know this, that space is this tetrahedral, hexagonal, scalar lattice. You've probably seen some of Nassim's work, and he's like, everything's tetrahedrons, man. The black hole is a tetrahedron, and if you look at it, you go into eternity. Anyway, sorry, I love Nassim. And so basically, this is the structure of space, but the problem is that if everything was that structure, if everything was in equilibrium like that, you would have nothing. It'd be a bunch of energy, but nothing would exist. No matter. Nothing like us, like this. If this is in equilibrium, I can't interact with it. So that means, interestingly, that somehow disequilibrium, coming out of the perfection to slight imperfection, maybe, that's also perfect, is the key for how matter comes into being, right? Doesn't that sound like the perfect teaching of the matter, the mother, by the way? That you don't have to be perfect, my boy. Just be yourself. Your imperfections are perfect to me. I love you the way you are. I'm in a mood today, as you can tell. So how do we get from equilibrium to the disequilibrium that then makes the structure of matter? Well, it looks like tensegrity, Buckminster Fuller. You've got attractive nodes that are vibrating and radiating, pushing and pulling at the same time. And when you've got a set of 6 of these vibrating, all you got to do is radiate one of those little nodes out, and now all of a sudden the rest spins, curves, and forms a geometry. And you know what that geometry is? The pentagram, or the pentagon, which we're going to talk about a lot more. And when we look at this equilibrium state and we try to go the other way, I was like, well, what happens if you have 7? Well, if you've got a hexagonal lattice, you can't shove another piece of energy into it. So if you go to 5 and one radiates out, it's going to go somewhere, right? It's got to move through the field. But how does it move? It has to literally move everything else in the field to go. And so 7 is all about propagation of radiation through space-time. Pretty cool, right? So what about this 5 thing? What does the 5, the pentagon, really do here? It lets space-time go from flat, essentially equilibrium state, to curved state, just like a dome. You can't have a dome unless you have pentagonal intersections for those triangles. And space-time curvature happens to be exactly what Einstein described as gravity. So gravity is really just the fabric of space curving, bending, flowing around, planetary bodies and stars and galaxies and supermassive black holes, other cool things like that. So if you break it down, what you're really looking at is this equilibrium surface, curves. It can go into extreme curvature, extreme gravitational connection at certain points. And if it goes to the 7, it can't fit. So it actually has to create a structure of spin. And we look at domes and we look at geodesic curvature, we see that every dome is just like an elaboration of these frequency sets. And as you go through higher and higher frequency sets, the 5s, the little pentagrams, just get further away from each other. And that's it. And now you're talking about a bigger circle versus a smaller circle. Well, there's something very interesting about one part of this geometry, because I realized that if space-time has to curve to make matter, what's the first matter that it's creating? Anybody know? The proton. The proton is the key to all matter, because that is literally our structure of mass. The weight in our bodies, the weight in this crystal, all of this has mass and weight because of the protons in it. Protons are geodesic spheres. And if protons are geodesic spheres, there's something really interesting about that, because the curvature of the structural layers of the proton all come down to this geometry. And I started going, well, that's interesting. If it's going down through the layers at that geometry, then it's actually the 5, and then also itself inverted, the 5 and the 5, and that makes 10, and the 5 to the 5 to the 5 to the 5 rotating through a structure has a very interesting shape. Where have I seen that before? Oh wait, that's the top-down structure of DNA. So the vortexes inside the proton, the geodesic curvature structure of the proton itself, matches the structure of DNA? What does that mean? Well, if you've got a proton and you've got these vortices made of these pentagonal intersections and they go all the way down to the core, the thing is spinning at the speed of light, there's got to be some way that protons receive information and transmit information out. Now, I'm kind of being brief on a lot of topics here, but are you guys still following me? Okay, great. We're staying high level enough to have some fun. So let's look at the proton. And I started getting into this, and I'm like, oh, okay, so this is the structure of the rotary vortexes going into the proton and also coming back out of the proton through the 5 upper hemisphere points and the 5 lower hemisphere points. By the way, there's 12. That's a vector equilibrium. And I started looking at the math of the layering and what's actually happening in the information structure. And what I essentially discovered is that these hemisphere vortices are literally like DNA information storage structures. And they all connect in to the core of the proton, which happens to be an excavated dodecahedron. We all like dodecahedrons, don't we? I mean, clearly this room is like, sweet, I knew there was a reason I bought that necklace. But it's not just a dodecahedron, it's a dodecahedron with perfect equilateral triangles bending into it, because that's carrying the energy from the outside to the inside. And, you know, this is not a solid structure. It's made of light, high energy light that has the ability to pulse in and out of different states. And guess what form the inside of that proton core creates? An icosahedron. But it's sub-Planckian. We're not going to get into that. Just so you know, not yet. And so we've got these vortice rays. We zoom in here. We start to look at this structure. And one thing I realized is that the little pentagonal structure that makes that up, you know, if you go around the whole circle of it, it's 360 degrees, right? But what happens if you go around the circle and one additional turn? What number do you get? Anybody know? The answer is 432 degrees. Where have we heard that before? And if we look at the structure of this, that means there's exactly 13 steps to get to a 432 degree rotation as we go down into the proton. Well, that implies that there's basically a 12-step sequence batch and then something breaking the batch of information and moving to the next sequence. And guess what? That means that you just line up a few of these and you end up with exactly 64 in these perfect little sets of essentially, 60 in array and broken up into 4 different parts and a stop sequence at the end that completes the pattern. And where do we know that that exists? That is DNA. Literally, that's DNA. So the geometry of the structure of the proton is actually where the structure of DNA comes from. This is the original DNA, the information storage of space-time itself. So what I'm really getting at here is that there's 64 codons in our DNA. The structure of the proton actually operates like DNA in a way that it has the same patterning of the way that it structures its codes, right? We have 432 times 200 is the moon's orbital speed in kilometers a day. 432 times 2000 is the sun's equatorial diameter. 43,200 divided by 2 is the Earth's circumference in nautical miles. 432 times 200 is the day and the number of seconds. I mean, you guys have probably heard this stuff before, right? 13 moons in a year. My God, are we in some kind of simulation matrix thing or what? Or is this all just God's idea of beauty? Well, it turns out that the number of seconds in the estimated age of the universe is also 4.32 times 10 to the 7th. And I was like, well, I wonder what that is in Planck time. So I took that and I actually divided it into Planck time, and you get 8.07719 times 10 to the 60th, assuming the 13.7 billion years since the Big Bang. Why is that number important? Well, it turns out that that 10 to the 60th is really important because that's exactly the number of oscillations that we count in the volume of a proton. Are you getting the hint? What does this mean? This means that protons are literally growing with the universe. Every Planck second, every proton in your body is recording that state. Protons are the ultimate hard drives, dude! Yeah! Talk about solid state, dude, right? It's like, I'm a freaking proton machine, man. I am storing so much information. I mean, it really makes you look at crystals storing energy a little differently, doesn't it? I mean, tables, chairs, objects, rooms. How many times have you gone into a place and you felt like you could feel the history of the place? The Akashic record is not just in an astral state or an etheric state. It's literally recorded into our matter. Holy guacamole. So if mass is holographic like this, it's like the entire information storage of every moment in the universe is stored in every proton throughout the universe. And by the way, the protons are entangled with each other. Holy crap, what does that mean about space in general? And as John Wheeler and other guys have proposed and began to see, well, geez, entanglement and wormholes might not be that different. In fact, they may be the exact same thing, which means that all the entangled particles that happen every time you touch something and you set it down, you're now entangled or connected to it in some way. When you've touched someone, shook their hand, you have a tiny bit of entanglement with that person. What you're really doing is you're creating a wormhole network to create a communications network of information with everything that you're coming into contact with all the time. Holy cow, right? We are this physics. Our experience of reality is essentially a structural interface in order to relate and be in connection with the natural, beautiful information structure that everything in the universe was built to be. All of our chakras are essentially plugins. You've got FireWire, you've got USB, you've got your power system, you've got all these different connection points inside of our bodies that literally are designed to roll up all that data and connect it and make it practical for use. So tomorrow, we're going to get into the chakras really deep and look at the magical powers of each one of these geometries throughout this progression. But for the purpose of this talk, let's go to Starship technology. Doesn't that sound like fun? Okay, well, first, as we discuss the Starship technology of today and this time, we must come to understand the layers and the dimensions of conventional propulsion means, right? So, what we essentially do is we fill a gigantic tank full of dinosaur blood and load it all the way up to the top. We get in a chair in the very, very top of it. It's a very small chair on a very large object. And essentially we run a fuse and we light that fuse and we put some very poor souls up on the very top of this very big bomb. And we hope that it doesn't blow up and destroy them all, or all of us. We light that fuse and we push our way up into space-time, right? This is how we think we got to travel. If we can make a big enough explosion, we'll go faster, right? So what do? Ion propulsion. Let's get nuclear bombs blowing up behind us, right? Like, let's really get this thing going. And essentially, when we're doing this, we are pushing through that structure that is equilibrium. We're literally pushing against the structure of space-time. You know when you hit the gas in the car and it's like, ugh. Well, if you got a car like me, it goes, boom, right? That feeling, that G-force, that's gravitational force. What are you feeling? You are feeling the structural layers of the energy of space-time interacting with your structure of space-time, and there is resistance between the two. You're pushing through the fabric of space. And so the further you push, the harder you push, the more G-force you do. If you're Tom Cruise in Top Gun Part 2 or whatever, it's like, it's going to just crush your body at some point. And we're like, yeah, but if you just keep accelerating, you'll just keep going faster. And then we're like, well, actually, there's a limit because eventually you try to go so fast that all of space-time is pushing against you, and it literally takes infinite energy to get across the speed of light barrier. How many people have heard about this, right? Do you know what I'm talking about? Okay, a couple people, all right. All right, well, we're gonna get you there, I promise. So our current space industry is like, yes, if we light a big enough fuse and we rock a big enough rocket, and we ride this thing, and we try to get to the nearest star system, Alpha Centauri, 4.37 light years away, our fastest spacecraft goes pretty fast. It's only going to take us 18,000 years to get there. And so you've got, Stephen Hawking, bless his heart, no extraterrestrial beings will ever come to this planet because it takes too long to get here. And I'm like, bro, that's what we thought when we were riding horses. Now we're flying fighter jets. Like, you don't know about the technology until you do. And so this inverse force relationship that's created is really a big problem. We're pushing against the force in space-time, we're creating resistance, and it's creating a space-time wake. That space-time wake is directly related, that inverse force is related to the pressure created by wavelengths of light. We actually have the keys already. When you look at the 1 over x structure of inverse gravitational force and you look at the 1 over x structure of wavelengths of light, it's like, well, duh. You're compressing against the light lattice that is space-time, and you can only compress the frequencies so much because there's energy there. There's a lot of energy there. And, the beauty, though, of this connection is that if we look at light at a deeper level, we realize that anytime we take a circle, what we're getting is that 1 over x. You divide up a circle, it's one circle divided by a certain number of points in that circle, right? And so the circle itself, and these geometries I'm talking about, the pentagram, the hexagram, the heptagram, these are all 1 over x's. This is 1 over 5. And so this is actually showing us that there's a key inside of the way light works and wavelength works that can connect us to gravity. And we've already started to prove it. There's a project called Circulating Light Beams, and we've realized that we can trap light inside a crystal, cause it to circulate, and we start swirling space-time. Space itself starts to twist and create a gravitational force. Ooh, isn't that interesting? And the guy who did this, Ronald Mallet, he created a company called Chrono Institute, literally studying how time and everything works because space and time are the same thing. Space is time. So if you circulate light, you can also create a time envelope, and that's really what we're getting to, a space-time envelope around the craft. Now, where else are we seeing light interacting with gravity? Roger Shor and Guido Fetta, the K drive and the M drive, right? It's this weird-looking little cone, and all it does is it radiates energy inside of it, right? And that energy, as it's moving and bouncing around in the cone, there's nothing that comes out of it, but it creates force. It pushes itself. And the scientists seeing this, they're like, what? How is that happening? Well, the answer is that there's a standing wave interference pattern of the light that's bouncing off the structure of space, which is also made of light, right? So the propulsion is not jetted out, the propulsion is internal. I forgot I have a slide for this. That's great. So you've got this light cone energy, and there's a direction that's moving because as the light's traveling through the cone, it's creating force pressure that's bouncing off of the internal structure of space inside the craft. And guess what? Nothing has to come out. It's literally just light bouncing around, and it propels itself through space-time. Wow. We also have another approach, which, some people have mentioned. I heard Linda mention it earlier. She's talking about the Alcubierre drive, the idea of the warp system that contracts space-time ahead of a craft and expands it behind a craft. And, NASA did a big thing with Harold White and some others creating the futuristic starship, right? And they're like, yeah, let's market it. We'll even write Enterprise on the side. The kids are really going to love this, and they're going to get behind NASA now. Yeah, because we've got this super slick Starcraft. We're going to build it. It's got some ring systems. It's got some things, of course. As far as we can tell, they haven't actually solved this problem because if they did, well, maybe it's all secret. Maybe it's all thrown into Black Ops projects or whatever. Tough to say. But essentially what this thing is supposed to do is contract the space-time in front of the spacecraft and expand the space-time behind the spacecraft. And so you're literally going to a destination and you're like, I'm going to pull that destination closer to me and I'm going to push the place I came from far away from me. Now, that's an interesting idea, isn't it? But there's kind of a problem with this. Because what you're trying to do now is you're trying to extend outside of yourself or your craft to a whole region of space. It's like me in the red car that's out there. And somehow I'm going to go, all right, I'm going to just basically bring that red car closer to me. And everything in between, what's going to happen with all that? It's all got to somehow contract. And then behind me, I'm going to take this thing and move it away from me. But then what happens to all of this little bit of space? And what happens to all of you, right? This is a very, very interesting and troubling dilemma when we look at the physics of this. And as a Tai Chi practitioner, I'm like, oh, this is a big problem. You try to move things outside of your core out here, very hard. Bring close to your core, very easy to move. No problem. Big force is in the core. All the force comes from the core of our mass, the core of our gravity. So how can we then reapply this solution and say, instead of trying to contract all this energy out here and move it closer to us, what if instead we look at the structure of the energy inside the craft and we simply work on modifying its field? That, my friends, is what we're going to get into, is transpositioning. And so what we need to do this is create a boundary condition in space-time. And what is another word for that? An event horizon. And if we look at Nassim's work on the proton, essentially the edge of the proton is an event horizon. A proton is just a miniature singularity. And I know that that's true because if you model the geometry of the proton, you get down to the center, it goes sub-Planckian. It enters a place where it cannot curve any further. In other words, infinite space-time curvature, right? And so we're going to create this artificial boundary condition. And interestingly, we do that with the idea of a circle, right? Well, let's take a look at some of the spacecraft that we have visiting our world. I wonder why they use this shape so often. The flying saucer shape, I mean, even the NASA suggestion of a craft has these two big ring systems, which suggest that they're getting close to these insights if they haven't implemented them already. And why do that shape? And of course you can do it in a triangle craft. You just put them in the three corners, or you do it at the front or the end of a Tic Tac, you know? But essentially what you want to do is create this ring system to then modulate the internal gravity field of the craft so that you don't fly off and you're like, woo, you can just be like, boom, all right. I'm dancing on my spaceship, that's fun. And you've got a 0-point field to isolate the inside from the outside, and you need some way to communicate the positioning of the craft to space-time. What I just said there is you need a way to communicate the positioning of the craft to space-time. Okay, we're gonna come back to that one in a second here. So we create this consistent space-time, and here you are around a planet, but if you can communicate that the craft is in a different position than when it starts, you just be around the other planet. And why would that happen? Because if you can create a standing wave gravitational envelope around your craft that literally is disconnecting you from that intense fabric, that thread, all those threads, all that energy, instead of pushing through it and trying to speed up and accelerate through it, you simply remove yourself from that structure, and now there is no limitation to your speed or your position. In other words, you don't accelerate at all. You wonder how they go, I mean, that's how. They are not in connection with the surrounding space. How do they fly into the ocean? No problem. How do you fly into a mountain? No problem. You just need to actually separate the space-time structure of the craft from the surrounding space-time. And my friends, that means that it doesn't necessarily mean that these craft are all fifth dimensional or ninth dimensional Arcturians, or whatever. Like, they don't need to be non-physical to have this capacity. They can evolve on a planet, they can be alive, and they can travel ships just like this, right? And there's no requirements really for having high consciousness to do this, except that how you do it requires a spiritual development process. And that's why this is so important to this group, because I'm literally going to show you how your consciousness and your being already encodes the keys for how we do this. Does that sound like fun? All right, we've got about 20 minutes and I think I could do it. So, we're gonna generate an artificial horizon. How are we gonna do that? Well, we've got to modulate the internal gravity of the craft and essentially get the structure of space in alignment. And that means, you want to create a field of sustained gravity inside the craft. And the geometry that enables that to happen happens to match the geometry of the throat chakra. Isn't that interesting? And the geometry of the throat chakra is actually composed of 3 times the geometry of the root chakra. Now, if you go with just the lotus petals, right, you would say, he's wrong, it's 4. Because there's 4 lotus petals in the root chakra. I know that. And there's 16 petals to the throat chakra, right? But we're talking about vibration. And vibrationally, you're on a planet, the 4 petals of the root chakra point to the 4 directions, point to the magnetic interconnection you have with the earth plane. And that has to vibrate up somewhere. And so the 5th point, the vibrational field of it, is actually a pentagonal spiral. It's a phi spiral, which is also the pattern in our DNA, which is also the pattern in so much kinds of matter. Of course, we're going to connect with the material world through the phi, right? Through the golden mean spiral. And the pentagon is the encryption for this. It's the key to this. It's the key to mass. It's the key to space-time curvature. So that's a lot of my stuff in my unified harmonic matrix presentation, and also some stuff I'm going to talk about tomorrow. So then the second phase is we need to create the equilibrium field. Well, how do we do that? Well, if the whole structure is hexagonal, 6s, then we need to basically interact with the structure itself and create our own artificial equilibrium state. Essentially one that's so well sustained that it can essentially be its own space-time field separated from the outside field. And so what do we do with that? We take the 6 of the sacral and the 6 of the sacral, which is then equals the heart, and we add 1 more 6 to it. That gives us the 3rd eye. Wait a second. Did he just say 666? What do you mean the 666 is the 3rd eye? Well, my friends, the sacral chakra is 6, the heart chakra is 12, the next geometric progression is 18. And 18 when you look at it from the Hindu perspective, is actually the infinite 9 of the yin and the infinite 9 of the yang. The infinite yin and the infinite yang combine to coalesce and form our ability to see all things in receptivity and all things in creativity. In other words, discern how the whole thing works. Space-time, duality, experience, empathy, all of that comes from this discernment. And the 6, 6, and 6 is 18, by the way. That is essentially the dynamic of the feeling and the vibration of the self, the vibration of that which is other, and the relationship between the two. And we're going to get into that tomorrow in a little bit more depth. The third phase is essentially the 21. And the 21 is 7, 7, and 7. This is about actually how we communicate to the structure of space. It's the solar plexus starts at 7, completes itself at 10, and the crown starts at 21 and completes itself in infinity. And so there's a direct relationship between mind, awareness, the astral, and where we are and what we are doing, right? How do you know you are here right now? You think you are, don't you? You're pretty darn sure you are. If you think you're somewhere else, you're probably partially there too. If you could think yourself somewhere else so strongly that you could literally change the vibrational field of your emotional body and your physical body and literally reorient your relationship to the structure of space-time around you, do you think teleportation is possible? I think it is too. So, let's build it in a starship. And then we don't all have to be perfect masters. My stepmom could levitate, which is partially what led me down this path. My dad, my stepbrothers, and I saw her across the lake, literally floating like 3 or 4 feet above the ground. She had dedicated her life to teaching people about divine love. And the woman was literally in like prayer state, like all the time. She'd go pick up as many blankets as she could at Goodwill or whatever, just walk around, give them to homeless people all day. She like solved crimes. She'd see a newspaper clipping of like a murder and she'd be like, take me to the police station. She solved murders. She was really amazing, amazing woman. Hi, Carolyn. Thanks for dropping in. So we're essentially looking at how these 3 rings can essentially interact with the internal gravity, the space-time envelope to create the event horizon, and then propagate the information to space-time that tells us where we're going and where we're looking at. So what does that give us? And how can that get us there? Well, if we break this down and we start really looking at it, we basically get the summary of what I've just shared, which is like, here you go. You've got your internal gravity, your 0-point space-time, superluminal positioning. It all comes down to the relationship with the structural field itself. How does the structural field work? And essentially, it's broken down into these 3 big pieces. You have the geometry of gravitation and the structure of mass that creates curvature, the geometry of equilibrium, which creates an equilibrium state that's able to interact with the equilibrium state, and a geometry of radiation that's able to force rotary structural change in space-time. In other words, how does mind connect to matter? How does mind tell us where we are? And so we apply all 3 of those concepts, to this craft, and essentially we gain the ability to jump through space. And maybe we'll use some other technologies like sonic ULF propulsion to float above the Earth. But if we really look at these geometries, what I'm getting at here is not just new stuff. I mean, you look at the sacredness of this particular geometry and look all over the place. I mean, it's like Celtic knotwork and tetragrammaton. Oops, I went too fast there. Sorry about that. And then the hexagon, you've got like, the seal of Solomon and graphene and like it's on the dollar bill and like all these structures that connect in space back to these. And a lot of that is things I'm going to talk about tomorrow, is like going into the real sacred lineage of these geometries, the cultural lineage of these geometries. And you can also learn about it from the Unified Harmonic Matrix. If you want to watch that video, you can just scan that with your phone. You have 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's all right. You could just Google it. I'm just messing with you guys. So essentially, all right, we've got this idea about how we can create the propulsion systems and interact with space-time and cause this jump. But that's not all that makes a spaceship. So to get the rest of the spaceship, you need more than that. You need energetic field generation. You got to create energy of some kind. And this is why friends of mine like Nassim and, I know countless others actually, we don't need audio for that, are building new energy systems. And they're working on the prototypes for these different systems to create standing wave fields that are generating energy right out of the structure of space itself. Because after all, space-time is very, very full of energy. There's other ways to do this. By the way, I was just shown a project recently where they're taking graphene sheets and Brownian motion on the sheets of graphene are creating a flow of charge. They literally just create a solid state battery that constantly fills itself up. There's a guy who's like, I heard a story about the guy, he has a piece of this material and he has it plugged into his phone and he's charging his phone with a little piece that looks like foil. Whoa, really cool. So we also need life support systems, and there's a lot of ways we can do this. We have the ability to generate molecules and objects one molecule at a time, and this is really the key to developing the capacity to replicate. The ability to create resources and materials without mining them out of a planet. Because when you're in a really advanced civilization, you're not going to go mine planets. If you can control the structure of space-time, what are you going to do? You're going to develop your own materials as you need them. Just like in Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry was a genius. He's like, yeah, we don't need gold. Why would I want gold? I don't need gold. I can create a cappuccino anytime I want. We don't need a financial system in any of the same way as we do now once we have replication. And this technology is coming down the pipe really fast. And if we're not already doing things like replicating gold, we will be very soon. And so it's important to realize this because this says that the universe is not just abundant, it's infinitely abundant. Literally, any area of space-time can become anything that we need. And that doesn't, of course, stop the idea of wanting to, grow food and plant trees and get fresh tomatoes because, you get that GMO store-bought Safeway tomato, and then you go and you get a fresh tomato out of the garden at somebody's house. You ever notice how much the information is different in your mouth? Talk about a different proton recording. So we also need a gravity drive. And how are we doing that? Well, essentially, we're doing what I was showing you, but the way this works is you create, through a laser interference cavity, you create two counter-rotating fields, leveraging the geometries that I discussed, and you're internally mirroring the vibrational waves coming off of the lasers, and just like in the crystal that I talked about, that they got light spinning inside of a crystal and it warped space, the same thing can happen through kind of an artificial crystal generated by a feedback structure around the craft where the light is shooting in the laser this way and this way. The lasers are interacting and mirroring in the space, creating a standing wave field around the space, emanating a field that's now isolating the structural geometry of space-time around the craft. Sorry, I know that was pretty heavy duty, wasn't it? I'll try to say that more simply. I will maybe do questions afterwards. I can't. Okay, cool. You got it. So then basically we move to the Atlas. How the heck do we jump to another star system? Well, I had this thought a long time ago, and as a Syrian engineer before I came to this planet, this was just kind of totally well known. But on this planet, it's like nobody knows this stuff. So I had to kind of work my way back to figuring it out. And to figure it out, I was like, oh, right, okay, so every star has a different specific spectral frequency set. Do you know that? Literally every single star has its own signature, its own symphony, its own song, right? And every single star is different. And I was like, well, that's really cool because now, essentially, the entire sky is like a library of different frequency sets, right? And we could postulate that, well, maybe if I could just triangulate a set of frequencies, then I could determine a location. That's how we do triangulation right here on Earth. And, you know, I played a little role in that back in the past, which we won't get into. So essentially, could we triangulate stars to jump across the galaxy? And the answer is yes, and there's a little bit of a problem with that. Because when you're trying to jump long distances, what you're doing is you're saying, I'm going to go 100 light years, or 1,000 light years, or take 10,000 light years away. And now you have a bit of an issue. Because essentially, the 10,000 light year away location is basically 10,000 years ago is the light that you're getting from the stars in that region. In other words, those stars have evolved for 10,000 years since then. So their spectra is maybe a little different than it is right now. And we can't predict with most stars how that progression happens. Oh man, so what do we do? Well, it turns out, I was like, well, is there anything more stable than normal stars? And the answer is yes. They're called pulsars, or neutron stars. And it turns out that a neutron star, interestingly enough, these things are perfectly evenly distributed across the entire galaxy, right? Strange coincidence. And it turns out that they have a very particular pulse rate and vibrational fall off. So perfect, in fact, so exact, that we can tell the changes in a pulsar over hundreds of thousands of years. These things are literally like lighthouse beacons that an advanced civilization just kind of scattered around the galaxy to use as navigation systems. So we can triangulate 3 pulsar locations near any star system, anywhere in the galaxy, with almost perfect accuracy, and now we have the exact frequency sets we need to put into the laser array that vibrates the superluminal positioning geometry and allows us to jump to that location. So, we triangulate some pulsars, we jump to a position, and boom, we're there. Instantaneously. What if there were only 2? What do you mean? Let's say there were only 2. Oh, but you need 3. You got to have 3. Triangulation, it's key. It's key to measurement, it's key to distance, it's key to everything. Like, you can't actually ascertain a distant location without triangulating, right? Because anytime you just have a 2-dimensional surface or structure, it's very difficult for us to understand our distance relationship to that. So it's because it's just a line. But with the extra dimension added, we now have awareness of where in space and time we are related to that. And I'll get into that more tomorrow, because essentially the physics of spatial relationship is what that comes down to. So we also need a communication system. And as you guys know, we've already been teleporting information from the Earth to the stars and back again and all that kind of stuff. And so essentially, as we do that with, you know, the Chinese have teleported information to satellites and back, but yeah, the mechanisms they're using aren't as good as our own built-in mechanisms. We already have telepathic capacity. We already have this ability. We just need to augment that. We need to support and empower through technological interface actually ability to confirm our telepathy. And guess what? We're already doing it. You know, when you think of someone and they call you on the phone and you're like, dang, how did you know to just call me right now? That's telepathy in action. And we need a navigation system and framework. And so I'm actually building a 4D social operating system that essentially lets you navigate people like star systems and look at their planets as different collections of their data. And we're going to use this essentially to gamify massive change and transformation on the planet at scale. We're using this to drive capital from digital product sales to creating missions on the ground to help us organize all the people who don't want a 9-to-5 job anymore to actually do missions on the planet and earn bounties and earn badges, and essentially do this to gamify the whole planetary restoration process. So this is my big magnum opus project right now, and so You know, that's where most of my time is spent. And it's basically about, you know, creating a different kind of interface, a different kind of system. Okay, we're about time. I'm about out of time, guys. I'm sorry. So I'm going to wrap up to the end of this piece. And essentially, as we build these kinds of new systems that are more like Iron Man, more like Minority Report, what we're trying to do is get people out of the thing where they're stuck in their screen all the time, moving into more of AR-style technology, so you could slip your glasses out of your pocket, put them on your face, and boom, now you can see what you need to see, interact with the data, and then put the glasses away. Or not just spend all your time on social media, but actually go from social media and go out into the world and do missions and make a difference in the real world. Does that sound good? So I was going to show you a little bit about different species, but I'll just land it with these last few concepts that essentially what we're talking about in taking this leap into a new way of being is actually a spiritual leap. This is a foundational change in the nature of how we relate to ourselves. Of course, the key to all of our technologies is already inside of us. And we are already designed as the highest technology that will ever be. You know, we are essentially the evolution of billions of years of time and consciousness and reality. So if you want to become a pilot of a starship, work on your astral travel skills. If you want to work on interstellar diplomacy, start working on diplomacy right here on Earth. Start relating to all peoples and all tribes. Understand that we are part of a growing society on this planet, and we have to take charge of our own responsibility. We need to start open sourcing our skills and our gifts. We can start replicating materials so we don't have to mine the planet as much. We can bring our biosphere back into harmony and restore our planet together if we can simply understand that it's possible to do it, and the time is now, and there's never been a greater time because we have all the support we need. We have the angels, we have the guides, we've got our extraterrestrial homies. They're all here, they're all waiting for us. It's our galactic family. So let's do it. Let's go together. Let's go forward. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, guys. I do a few sessions, and I'm opening up some windows this year to come to different places. So if you have a community and you want me to come teach and do some martial arts or some Jedi training or whatever the heck you want, get into starship tech or astral travel practice, you can scan this and work with me. You can also just go to my website, adamapollo.com. That's a really good way. And tomorrow, I'm doing an ancient galactic alchemy course. So we're going to get into the root of magic and consciousness and this whole piece of how we are part of the unfolding lattice of creation itself. Tonight, I'm going to DJ a dance party for you guys. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Because we got to get in our bodies, right? So Larissa Stowe and Shakti Tribe, including drummer Matthew right here, who's been working his butt off. Can we give Matthew a big hand?
Yeah,
This dude,
Matthew, yeah.
I mean, he's literally setting up a party, organizing the sound, fixing the thing, setting up the speakers, going back, setting up for the party. I mean, it's crazy. So they're going to do a big performance, and then I'm going to DJ after that. I think I start around 9, so, have a cup of coffee, come out, get embodied with me. It's going to be really fun. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate your time.
Adam Apollo, yes, yes, yes.